regarding pages 16 through 30 in the Prentice Hall Reader, this chapter discusses how to write an essay. So when you find out that you have an assigned topic, which you sort of do in this class, but at the same time you get a lot of freedom to kind of adapt that topic to your own experience, to your own ideas. But nevertheless, when you have an assigned topic, you want to make sure that you know how long the paper is supposed to be, what kind of purpose you're supposed to be using. And again, the purpose is that you want readers to understand what you learned from this experience or how it affected you or whatever. But, that purpose has to come from whatever it is you're writing about for your topic. You also want to think about the structure. We know that the structure of this first essay is going to be narrative, descriptive. Narrative is what determines our structure, the fact that we're using chronology, we're using time to organize our essay. You also want to use audience as a clue. Yes, the people in your class, your peers, will be your audience. I will be your audience. The tutors who read your essay will be your audience. But also, I think part of the goal is to kind of reach a larger audience as well. So, it would be nice to have other people who don't even go to your school, who don't even live in your town, to be able to identify with what you're saying in an essay. I mean, that's the whole point of communication, right? To have people understand you, to understand your experience, and to identify with you. And, it's kind of a nice feeling to know that you created that experience through the words that you put on a page. So that's kind of the whole point. You want to think about the people in your class. In this class is your audience. I'm your audience. The tutors are your audience. But also, try to think about who else might you want to bring in as your audience. Let's see. I also want to talk about the different patterns of organization, what they're called. I'm looking at page 17 in particular. It talks about narrating, summarizing, describing, classifying, dividing, analyzing, comparing, contrasting, explaining, identifying causes and effects, defining, arguing, or persuading. So you want to make sure that you look at this chart on that page 17, and figure out, look at the column that says this is what this usually means, and then the likely organizational pattern, okay? It's very important that you know this because teachers in different classes will ask you to write different kinds of essays. You might be asked to compare and contrast the reigns of two different monarchs in history class. You might be asked to classify, parts of the body in an anatomy class. You might be asked to identify the causes and effects of a certain moment in history, or identify the causes and effects of a certain disease, okay? So this will come in handy from here on out. And I've heard science teachers before say that students do not understand what some of these terms mean. Like they don't know what the teacher is asking them to do. How terrible would it be to take a midterm or a final exam and have a term on that exam that, you feel like you would be capable of writing if you just understood what the term meant, okay? So it's really important that you understand what these terms mean and how you would go about organizing them. Places from which we can gather experiences to put in our essays come from our own observations, our own experiences in life. So how do we get that information from our minds onto the screen or the page? I think I mentioned before in the guidelines for paper 1, different ways that you can pre-write. So this section actually talks about different ways of pre-writing. It discusses free writing, which I described in some detail before. It talks about, writing in journals or blogs, which some people really enjoy. Brainstorming or mapping are great as well. You can ask yourself a bunch of questions and attempt to answer those questions. That's a way of getting ideas down. I did mention that some people like outlining. I also mentioned I'm not a particular fan of that when you're just pre-writing. I also want to talk about thesis statements, because perhaps not so much in this essay, this first essay, but in your research paper, thesis statements will play a huge role, and we'll spend a great deal of time talking about your thesis statements. So if we look at page 23, the section, how do you write a thesis statement, defining a thesis statement, you do want to take into account that your thesis statement is going to be problematic if it's too broad, and it's going to be problematic if it's too narrow. So you want to find an ideal thesis statement that allows you the freedom to examine your topic, but isn't so broad that it's completely overwhelming and you just don't know what to do. So if we look at page 23, we see some approaches. Somebody's thinking about violence in video games. So at the bottom of that page, the person comes up with an overall subject area that he's interested in, violence in video games, right? But that will not suffice for a thesis statement because that's too broad. I mean, there's so many things you could say about violence in video games. What is it, right? So the person narrows it to a topic. The topic, impact that violent video games have on behavior. Well, that's a little more specific. That's a little more graspable, right? That's a little easier to understand. But then if you look at page 24, it takes it to another step. So we go from the subject to the topic, finally to a thesis. And the thesis this person has arrived at is, violent video games desensitize players to violence, suggest that violence can be used to settle conflicts, and reward players for violent behavior. Now, do you think that this person arrived at this thesis statement after a couple minutes of thinking about it? No. This person arrived at the thesis statement after, I would say, a few weeks of research. Okay? So, yeah, you want to identify, this is mostly, again, about the research paper, but you will want to, and I'll walk you through these steps for helping you come up with a topic, a thesis, all that. But you want to make sure that you don't confuse a thesis statement with a subject or with a topic, because those are different, and you could run into trouble if you try to make a thesis statement out of the subject or the topic. So when you are writing a draft, you have to think about the organization, right? So again, it's important that you understand what those different terms, different patterns mean, and how they are typically organized. So for narration, which is our first essay, you're going to tell a story, right? You're going to narrate an event, and it's probably going to move chronologically, from the first event or moment to the last moment. You might have flashbacks, but again, time is the factor in all of this, okay? Your first essay is also going to be descriptive. So that means you're going to be including sensory information, right? Sense impressions. And when you're describing something, there's sort of a way or an order in which you can do it that will make sense. So if I walk into a room, I can describe it spatially if I want. I could start at the nearest, or the wall to my right, and I could move all around the room from that point. Then I could move to the ceiling, whatever's up there. I could move to the floor, okay? I could also decide to describe what seems to be the most important thing in the room, all the way to the least important thing in the room, right? So those are two different ways that I could organize my description. Also, make sure you look at the other typical body arrangements on pages 25 and 26 that discuss, like division, classification, comparison. So I think the reason that this chapter talks about the body of the paper first is because that's really the meat of your essay. That's really where you are establishing what you're going to talk about. Okay, introductions and conclusions present their own challenges. Okay, and they're kind of different parts of the essay. So then page 26 talks about the introduction. Now, people often have a lot of difficulty talking about the introduction and the conclusion. I'm going to make another video about that because this video is getting kind of long. So I'm going to stop here and I will talk about intros and conclusions in the next video.